Conservation is an important part of our lives as it restores ecosystems and prevents species from becoming extinct. Damage to habitat by means of floods and deforestation remains a big threat in our country. Over the past couple of weeks, we've seen floods and fires ravage several parts of our country, leaving humans and animals in danger. Well, to speak to us about the importance of conservation and why South Africa in particular should take a stand, we're joined by climate scientist at Stellenbosch University, Professor Midgley. Prof. Midgley, good to speak to you as always. What are the most effective conservation strategies for restoring ecosystems damaged by floods and deforestation? And I'd imagine that these are conversations that we should be having here in South Africa.
That's a good question. Thanks for having me. Look, conservation has a number of different strategies, and probably lying at the core is the idea of protected areas. And that has really been, there's been an idea that's lain at the center of conservation responses, basically since the beginning of conservation, and the first designation of such lands, for example, in the USA by Teddy Roosevelt, I think it was. But South Africa has been a leader in this sort of space, and originally the Kruger Park, for example, was designated as a conservation area, but it's really to support hunting by rich people. But so that's fundamentally where the notion comes from, that if you allow all of your land to be subjected to direct human pressure, you will ultimately wipe out all the endemic indigenous species. And then that results in a whole lot of strategies to identify where do endemic and indigenous species live in high concentrations, and then those sorts of areas become targets for conservation. So that's the core strategy for conservation.
Now, you raise an issue there around hunting, which I suppose brings up the question, how do we balance economic development with the need to protect natural habitats?
Well, this is really the challenge of our times, is how to get our ecological system and economic system to work together rather than to work against one another. We can't survive without an economic system, but the economic system cannot survive without a functioning ecological system. And ultimately, if we destroy our ecology, we will destroy our entire livelihoods. So this is not, this is not about purely just protecting nature. It's about protecting ourselves and a living and habitable country. And that's very, very important to point out, that conservation is not just a nice to have. This is really a strategy that lies at the heart of ensuring that South Africans have a decent quality of life and a decent environment. It's not a nice to have.
Now, what measures are being taken to address the immediate and long-term impacts of the recent floods and fires? One would imagine that to some degree, nature will take care of itself to an extent. But on the other side, it's floods after floods, and people are on the verge of recovery when the next set of floods or next disaster arrives.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out that nature is very resilient. And if you think of what the world has been through over hundreds of millions of years, been through some very significant adverse effects, like being struck by a meteorite, for example. And life has survived, the ecosystems have survived. The problem is us, and our social economic system is very fragile in relation to nature's resilience. And but we increase our risk to extreme events if we damage nature, and then nature is unable to protect us as much as it could have. This is the whole concept and idea behind the nature-based solutions approach to dealing with climate change, for example, is how can we ensure in areas that are experiencing high levels of flooding, how can we ensure that our natural ecosystems are resilient enough to absorb those floodwaters, to dissipate the floodwaters, to cleanse the water, and to continue providing us with the ecosystem services like clean and reliable water supply. And that means that the engineering field of building dams and building structures to mitigate the effects of flood risk must be done in conjunction with assessing and maximizing the resilience of nature at the same time. And far too many times in the past, that kind of engineering has been done without due consideration of nature, and we've lost a lot of opportunities through that. And we've got to really wake up and start making sure that nature helps us in even more ways than it already does.
You most rhetorically asked, what can we do? And I suppose that's the question that I'd like to ask is, what do we do? I mean, what is the plan? Do we have a plan to deal with these issues? For the last, I think, 3 or 4 years, South Africa has been hit by several disasters, particularly in the Western Cape and KwaZulu-Natal. And I'm not entirely convinced that we've been well prepared for the return of, or the recurrence of these floods and fires and so on.
Look, fires are part of many of the Southern African ecosystems. Fire is a natural part of those systems. In fact, they need to be burning on some frequency in order to maintain their biodiversity and to maintain the ecosystem and their structure and function. Fynbos burns, roughly every 9 to 12, 15 years. Savanna grasslands burn every second year, maybe every year in some areas. And those, those fires are part of the system. And South Africa has been ahead of the game in relation to the rest of the world in managing and understanding how to use fire. Flooding is a newer thing. And that really relates to two things. It relates to the exposure, but also to the underlying changes, the underlying pressure. So exposure is something that you can deal with by moving people out of harm's way. And unfortunately, we've seen a lot of unplanned development of informal settlements in areas that are very prone to flooding, and that's really asking for trouble. And when you get a wet cycle, like we're now in the Western Cape, it puts a huge number of people at risk, and it's miserable for hundreds of thousands of people. So, and that's a political question. It's a management question. It's an urban design question. And so urban design and all the politics has got to line up. We've got to be thinking in a much more joined up way about how to deal with these things, to reduce exposure, and then allowing nature to reduce the direct impacts by not damaging it.
You're absolutely right, Professor Midgley, because the question just doesn't rest on the Ministry or Department of Environment. It also involves human settlements, because human settlements are occupying areas that technically they shouldn't be occupying, but the very individuals who are occupying those areas argue that they have no alternative.
Well, and that's where the Climate Act is so important, because it has it really puts in place the kind of joined-up thinking that's required in terms of a disaster management response that has to be coordinated across different sectors, across different areas, and we're now experiencing the first impacts of climate change through extreme events, and this is how we're going to learn fast how to deal with the future long-term effects of climate change. And we had better start learning quickly, because these events are not going away anytime soon. These are with us for the rest of our lives, and likely with the lives of our children and grandchildren. So we've got to get our eyes wide open to sort these sorts of things out, because if we don't, it's going to be misery for hundreds of thousands of people.
Now, we've talked about political will, or the absence of political expediency in dealing with these issues. You've talked about the importance of us learning fast. Well, I mean, we're going back 3 or 4 years, if not more, when these catastrophes started hitting us. Is there an engagement by government to private sector, to institutions such as yours, where you're experts and are pretty familiar with what the horizon holds and can have these conversations and give the necessary advice on what measures need to be implemented super fast?
Well, I think that is increasing all the time, and universities are one of those institutions that has to step up to the plate and start to develop the courses and the training materials and produce the students who can think in this joined up sort of a way. Essentially, we need a new kind of graduate to tackle these very, very complex questions. Thinking in silos and thinking as a specialist is really what's got us into this problem, if you think about it. And so now, as we face a future where the consequences of past specialization and sort of optimization in energy, in urban environment, urban design, are now coming to bite us, because when you put them all together, it's not optimal. That's what we've got to work towards. And nobody's got the answer really yet. But South Africa has been ahead of the game in many of these areas. And the Climate Act actually represents more than 2 decades of thinking along these lines. So we've got a good head start on the rest of the world in many ways.